The history of African Americans in Delaware is a narrative of courage, bravery, perseverance, and achievement. It is a story of the struggle for human rights and dignity, and the overcoming of obstacles that persisted from the earliest colonization through the civil rights movement of the 20th century to today. It is a terrible irony that the coming of colonial peoples seeking religious and other freedoms in the New World was soon accompanied by the practice of large-scale human trafficking. African men, women, and children were packed into slave ships and stolen away from their homelands to function as slave labor in the American colonies.
Chattel slavery is the practice of having slaves who are not people, they're not individuals, they're a thing. So they're more akin to being like a cow or a table.
The first European settlers in Delaware were Swedish, Finns, and Dutch. Arriving aboard the ship Kalmar Nickel in 1638, Swedish settlers purchased land from the Lenape Indians and established a colony called New Sweden on Christina River, near present-day Wilmington. A black man named Anthony was among the first permanent settlers here. He came to the colony from the West Indies in 1639 aboard another Swedish ship, the Vogel Grip. Black Anthony lived on Tinicum Island and worked for the governor, cutting hay and serving as a member of the crew of the governor's yacht.
This genuine labor force with skills that they have bought from Africa as skilled craftsmen, these persons were a key to the American economy.
As colonies took root and grew, so did the slave trade. Even those who preached the word of God were not above the practice of owning slaves. Only in his will, in 1784, did Declaration of Independence signer Caesar Rodney unconditionally manumit his slaves. It took until 1786 for constitutional signer John Dickinson to unconditionally manumit the slaves who lived and worked on his farm just south of Dover. The Dickinson plantation owned a skilled workforce of people who included Dinah, a weaver, Pompey, who ran the household, Cato, who provided personal assistance, and Violet, who read to and cared for his children.
Even well-intentioned people had slave labor, and we understand that the Quakers liberated their blacks early through manumation, etc., but we still know that the plight of black Americans in Delaware was quite clear.
The paradox of living a subservient life in a new nation dedicated to the principle that all men are created equal was increasingly evident to African Americans.
African Americans resisted from the very beginning, from capture to transportation over on the transatlantic slave trade routes, to sale and to plantation, from rebellion to running away or day-to-day resistance.
Inspired by the principle of religious freedom expressed in the U.S. Constitution and by a vision of black self-determination, Peter Spencer led the movement that created the first independent African-American denomination in the United States.
This religion permeated the early development of the black community in the state of Delaware and throughout the nation.
Delaware was a border state, bridging slave states to the south and free states to the north. Here, increasing numbers of free black Delawareans led the movement to free others. This growing abolition movement was supported by Quakers like Thomas Garrett. Now, black and white abolitionists joined forces to increase activity on the Underground Railroad, a resistance movement of people and homes aiding freedom seekers. African American activists like Harriet Tubman and Samuel Burris jeopardized their own lives by guiding self-liberating slaves on the road to the North and freedom. Fueled in large part by the issue of slavery, the new nation moved forward into the Civil War in 1861. For the most part, Delawareans identified themselves with the Union, and African American Delawareans volunteered for service. Following the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, black Delawareans sought to rebuild their lives and families while fighting for their equal rights as citizens that should have been guaranteed to them by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States. Newly freed people actively pursued their right to an education. In 1869, the Howard High School for black students opened in Wilmington and would remain the only public high school in the state blacks could attend until the 1920s. Both during and after the Reconstruction period, black Delawareans' journey for social, political, and economic rights would be long and difficult, often meeting with discrimination and violence. During World War I, black men from Delaware served in America's segregated armed forces. While fighting for freedoms abroad, they and their families still faced discrimination at home. For these soldiers, American democracy was a blatant contradiction. The state's Jim Crow laws that relegated them to second-class citizenship persisted for nearly a century until the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For black Delawareans, education provided social mobility and broader influence in the community. Blacks continued to educate their children in a network of what were called colored schools, where many dedicated and determined teachers instructed their students, often in substandard buildings and with second-hand materials. Later, businessman and philanthropist Pierre Estepot spent his own money to fund the building of scores of new schools for black children throughout the state. These segregated schools produced many noted Delawareans, among them Lewis Redding, who in 1929 became the first black lawyer in the state. The State College for Colored Students, now Delaware State University, was established in Dover in 1891, and during its early years trained many of the state's black teachers. In spite of the slow pace of progressive movement for black Delawareans' equal rights, attorney Lewis Redding and other agents of change pushed tirelessly for an end to discrimination within the state's educational institutions. Redding filed 2 cases against public schools in Claymont and Hocassin. He filed on the grounds that public schools for blacks were inferior to those provided for whites. Judge Collins J. Seitz considered these 2 cases brought by black parents who demanded equal access to quality public education for their children.
My father ruled that segregated Delaware schools were separate and unequal. Writing, I conclude from the testimony that in our Delaware society, state-imposed segregation in education itself results in the Negro children as a class receiving educational opportunities which are substantially inferior to those available to white children otherwise similarly situated.
Following Seitz' 1952 ruling, the Belton case became part of the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education, in which the United States Supreme Court ruled in 1954 that state laws establishing separate public schools for black and white students were unconstitutional. While the efforts of Attorney Redding and Judge Seitz were proud moments for Delaware, Schools here did not fully integrate for decades, and discrimination in housing, hospitals, and employment persisted.
You see, during that period of time, there was discrimination in every facet of our society. We were held down only because of complexion.
Reaction to these discriminatory practices and inequalities in Delaware and across the country included peaceful demonstrations and protests, and later on, riots, after civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated.
The Martin Luther King assassination for the minority community and for poor people was just too much to take. And cities across this country erupted, and Little Wilmington was one of them.
So they started burning in Wilmington. They burned in many cities.
The riots were a reaction to decades of unresolved discriminatory policies and practices. They were a continuation of efforts to achieve equal rights.
From the 1950s, after black soldiers returned from serving in World War II and onward through the transformative decades to the present, Delaware has evolved and prospered from the courage, contributions, and achievements of its diverse citizens. Our state's outstanding leaders include the first blacks to serve in the Delaware legislature, William Winchester, who was elected to the House of Representatives in 1948, and Herman Holloway Sr., who was elected to the Senate in 1964. George Wright was elected mayor of Smyrna in 1981, the first black mayor in Delaware. That same year, James Baker became the first black president of Wilmington City Council and eventually mayor. James Sills became Wilmington's first black mayor in 1993, and Margaret Rose Henry became the first black woman elected to the Delaware State Senate in 1994. The election of Barack Obama as the first African American president of the United States and Delaware Senator Joe Biden as vice president reminds us how Delaware history continues in many ways to play a significant role in the making of the history of this country. Delaware, truly one state with many stories.